Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 12th webinar in our series. My name is Anuth Naushan, Project Manager of Courage to Act. Courage to Act is a 2-year national initiative to address and prevent gender-based violence on post-secondary campuses in Canada. It builds on the key recommendations within Possibility Seed's vital report, Courage to Act, developing a national framework to address and prevent gender-based violence at post-secondary institutions. Our project is the first national collaborative of its kind to bring together scholars, experts, and advocates from across Canada to end gender-based violence on campus. A key feature of our project is our free webinar series, where we invite leading voices to discuss key concepts and share promising practices on addressing and preventing gender-based violence on campus. Supported by Caucus, these webinars are also a recognized learning opportunity. Attendance at 10 or more live webinars and our National Skillshare series will count towards an online certificate. Our project is made possible through generous support and funding from the Department for Women and Gender Equality, WAGE, Federal Government of Canada. We begin today's webinar by acknowledging that this work is taking place on and across the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations. We recognize that gender-based violence is one form of violence caused by colonization to marginalize and dispossess Indigenous peoples from their lands and their waters. Our project strives to honor this truth as we move towards decolonizing this work and actualizing justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls across the country. I'd like to pause now and invite everyone to take a few deep breaths with me, because this work can be challenging. Many of us may have our own experience of survivorship and of supporting those we love and care about who've experienced gender-based violence. A gentle reminder here to be attentive to our well-being as we engage these difficult conversations. And before I introduce our speakers today, a brief note on the format. Our speakers will present for about 35 to 40 minutes, and I invite you to enter questions and comments into the question and answer box, and I will monitor this, and together we will pose these questions to them at the end. The Q&A will happen in the last 10 minutes of the webinar. At the end of the webinar, you will find a link to the evaluation form. We'd be grateful if you take a few minutes to share your feedback as it helps us improve. This is anonymous. Following the webinar, I will also email you with a copy of the evaluation form and a link to the recording so that you can view the webinar again and share with your networks. We have 2 really wonderful speakers today, and I'm excited to introduce you to them now. Vatineh Magaji is from Thompson, Manitoba, Treaty 5 territory, and now resides in Winnipeg, Treaty 1 territory, where she completed her BSc in genetics at the University of Manitoba. She served 2 terms as president of Justice for Women Manitoba, a student group addressing gender-based violence within the campus and the greater community. She continues her advocacy work with involvement in Courage to Act student organizer community of practice with REES through the Youth Advisory Board and various roles at the Women's Health Clinic. And Casandra Fullwood is a Scarborough-born Afro-Caribbean woman residing in Toronto. Her feminist politics are largely focused within Black community and navigating feelings of bodily unsafety and lack of autonomy within white society. Casandra is the founder of We Heal Together, which is a Black survivor space that focuses on collective community healing. Casandra is in her 4th year of Art and Contemporary Studies at Ryerson University. In her free time, Casandra likes to watch Love Island and create art that centers Black intimacy and Zami love. So as you can see, we have a really wonderful and brilliant lineup today, and I'm excited now to turn it over to our presenters.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm Vatineh. I'm very glad to be here to speak on this very important topic. It's always been important, but I'm glad that the cultural conversation is shifting to focus this conversation, and I'm excited to be able to share my experience and learn from everyone today.
Hi everyone, I'm Casandra, and I am also glad to be here and talk about why we should focus on supporting Black survivors and Black survivor-led support groups. Thank you so much to Courage to Act for bringing me here today.
So here is a list of the acknowledgements we wanted to make. We want to also make it clear that this information and this knowledge comes from a variety of resources, including and beyond what's listed here. We need to recognize the experience of ourselves in this conversation, of mentors, the community, academics, people who have been organizing to do this work. And we also need to acknowledge the parallels that can be drawn between Black survivorship and Indigenous survivorship. Earlier in the land acknowledgement, we talked a little bit about colonialism and its impact on gender-based violence. We want to expand on that a little bit later. But we also want to make it clear that this work and this knowledge is not isolated, or it's not insular. It comes from a variety of sources. So in our conversation, we want to first talk about what makes Black survivors different from others, what sets them apart. So we'll go through each of these elements, and hopefully that will help give us a picture to understand first why they're different, and then how we can serve them in a way that is catered to them and their individual experiences. So we know that the experience of gender-based violence can never be generalized per se, but when we talk about Black experiences, quote unquote, there are some commonalities that apply to a Black experience that can be thus generalized or applied to gender-based violence survivorship. So the first of these is the risk of microaggression. So at any point in a person of color's life, or a Black person's life specifically, there is a risk of microaggression solely based on the fact that we are interacting with humans, and humans do have a tendency of making mistakes. And sometimes these mistakes can cause harm. And that's not even accounting for the people who are intentionally causing harm. Just by virtue of interacting with others, there is that risk, right? In responding to disclosures, the risk of microaggression can be or is analogous to maybe language that perpetuates rape culture, right? In the same way that that is harmful. So when Black survivors utilize non-Black spaces, there is that underlying risk of being triggered by violent language by virtue of them being survivors, and the use of language that promotes rape culture. But then there's that additional layer of the risk of microaggression that's applied. This has the potential to cause kind of an underlying defensiveness in the survivor who's seeking out these resources, and that serves to protect them from hurt. This reaction, though, can be perceived as like dismissal or apathy, and that's something that we want to circle back on a little bit later. So our idea, or our thought process, is that being paired with someone that looks like you as a survivor can help create this underlying comfortability as opposed to defaulting to defensiveness. And it can also provide a chance for the survivor to not have to explain the microaggression, be able to skip over that part of explanation and kind of get to the root of their primary concern, which might be their experience in gender-based violence.
So next, we're going to talk about the different ways in which Black survivors have to protect members of their community, and they're concerned about the stereotypes that are perpetuated when they enter survivor spaces. Black survivors, even though, like Vatineh said earlier, we don't all represent the same experience, Black survivors are still upholding the entire Black community when they enter survivor spaces. So with that being said, they don't want to perpetuate Black people as violent, Black men as sexual predators, and things like that. So with that concern, it's really hard to disclose to people who already have set notions of what Blackness is or what Black community is. There's also the idea of policing and authority perpetuating harm onto Black communities. So how are Black survivors able to enter survivor spaces and not be told, oh, the police could be the first option for you if that's not a safe option? I would also like to add that a lot of times in survivor spaces. There is like a notion of hypersexualization directed towards Black survivors. So it's hard for them to be seen as people who can have harm inflicted upon them.
So part of what Cassandra was touching on can be, I guess, expanded on with the term misogynoir. So when we're defining that as one of the stereotypes of Blackness, and we'll expand on other stereotypes as well, misogynoir specifically refers to basically the intersection of both Blackness and presenting as feminine or being a woman, however it applies to the survivor. So this can cause kind of a double jeopardy of hatred, essentially, because there are identities that lead to people wanting to control your body, but also to display your body and own your body, and also repress your body in all of these same ways. So all of these things come together to create an environment that is generally unsafe. And when it comes to survivorship of sexual violence, we can see that playing out in the way that these survivors are perceived. So on the screen, there is a screenshot of an article, that's a series of articles by these authors who are touching on the idea of misogynoir and how it plays out in popular culture. So in the article, or in this specific part 3, they were talking about the WAP music video and the ripple and the impact that it had on our culture, essentially, when it first came out. And they discuss how that messaging would have been received if they were not women, owning their sexuality and taking back what had been previously taken from them. So I encourage everyone to give each of those parts a read, because in the third part, they also expand the impact of having these notions in our culture of wanting to repress women, even if it's subconscious, and how it impacts the way that we perceive violence against women, especially Black women. And they use the example, again, very directly tied to this topic of Cardi B and Meg Thee Stallion promoting this music and putting out these music videos that are sexualized, but it's them sexualizing themselves and owning their sexuality. And we see kind of the flip side of the idea that Black women shouldn't be sexual or only on our terms, applied to when Meg was shot by a Black rapper, and the discourse that was going on around that event. Meg was, met with a lot of victim blaming and people trying to understand what she would have done to deserve this type of violence and things like that, which is a conversation that we see a lot when it comes to survivors of gender-based violence as well. So we can see this as a very concrete example of kind of the timeline of misogynoir as it plays out in popular culture and the way that words become actions and become feelings.
Before we move on to the next one, I want to add, like, misogynoir is a term created by Moya Bailey. She's a Black woman who just wanted to talk about the specific misogyny that Black women face. And like Vatineh said, Black women are should be allowed to own their sexuality and express notions of pleasure or anything that is self-advocating for bodily autonomy. Next, I'm going to talk about hypersexualization and generational trauma, and why that plays a role in Black survivors, should play a role in Black survivor support. Hypersexualization is something that Black women have been facing since the colonial project has started. The ideas that Black women are seen as more sexual or wanting to be pursued, or even our very own bodies are seen as for the male gaze in terms of in relation to our Blackness is a form of hypersexualization. This also affects people who are non-women. When we think about the Black body, I added Patricia Hill Collins' book, Black Sexual Politics, because she talks a lot about how Black people are viewed as Black sexuality has been co-opted by whiteness and replaces Black people's autonomy to experience sex in a non-violent way. So yeah, it's a good read if you want to read further on how hypersexualization influences sexual trauma. Within my survivor spaces that I create, I try to take note that sexual violence might be something that's passed on generationally and might not be a first person experience that Black folks experience, but it's something that they feel within white gaze.
So on this slide, we want to expand on some of the prevailing stereotypes of Blackness that are in play and how they relate to people's experience in seeking support for gender-based violence and why traditional means of seeking support might not necessarily work for them. So the first of these stereotypes is that hypersexualization that Casandra had touched on earlier. And really the point that I wanted to raise is that this underlying sentiment of Black women, and we'll touch on why this extends to the entire Black community or how later on, but this hypersexualization gives a underlying feeling that when violence occurs against these women, because they're hypersexualized, then it is an explanation. It makes sense that they would experience this type of violence because they are seen as being all of these things. They're seen in these ways. So we need to understand and acknowledge that, and the way that it creates this ambivalence towards Black survivors. Just like we saw in the example of Cardi B, and Meg Thee Stallion, and the way that they were seen because of their embracing of that hypersexualization. We also see in the way that Meg was reacted to when she had that violence enacted against her. The next is the strong Black woman, and that is exemplified in the picture that we've attached here. The quintessential figure of this idea is Aunt Jemima. So here we see her living to serve this strange white boy who doesn't appear to be related to her in any way, but it extends past this idea of servitude to the white person. This underlying idea of strength and being a caregiver, living to serve others in her family, putting her own needs aside, it can be connected to this racist belief that exists for a long, long time, that Black people in general had a higher threshold for pain. This was used to justify medical torture and experimentation in the name of scientific advancement. And we can see a very clear-cut example of this in the work of James Marion Sims. He's said to be the father of modern gynecology, but it is because he was doing experimentation on Black women without any sort of sedation or anesthetic. So the aftershocks of these behaviors are felt today, and you can see them through the stereotype that Black women don't need support, that they handle things internally, they don't want to burden their families. And this creates a very real barrier to accessing traditional supports by either withholding these supports or not offering them to a same degree that would be offered to a white survivor. But there's also an internalized stigma towards and associated with accessing traditional counseling services. So all of those factors play into not only how traditional resources may not be applicable or may not be appropriate for Black survivors, but also the way that Black survivors feel excluded from these spaces.
I do, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
I do want to also add that, like, with that being said, like, it does create a sense of a lack of apathy, a lack of genuine emotional response to Black survivors. And if Black survivors aren't able to access spaces where they're humanized, it could be a huge problem. So I just want to say, like, all these like historical contexts and providing you with information in terms of the colonial gaze, hypersexualization, it all contributes to the lack of emotional response and empathy towards Black survivors, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is also something that we can see in this last point, the idea of the angry Black woman, this underlying defiance, non-cooperativeness, aggressiveness, belligerence. When these are the subtext of how we see a Black survivor, it makes the interactions that we have with them misguided, and it doesn't make it doesn't help us get to the root of these behaviors. We miss the context as to why these behaviors might be taking place. So with this stereotype, a guarded reaction from a Black survivor could be interpreted in a different way if a white survivor were acting similarly. So because we touched earlier on the fact that Black survivors may struggle with opening up for fear of microaggression or judgment, it makes sense what the root of that type of reaction might be if they seem guarded or closed off. So when disclosing trauma that's occurred, we should be creating a space in which Black survivors don't feel pressured to modify their tone for those fears, for fear of playing into those stereotypes, or that their audience might change their perception. Instead, we want to encourage creating spaces where people feel okay to react in any way and not feel as though they are speaking for their whole community. So all of these stereotypes and what we've touched on so far create caricatures of people. The dramatization of an individual makes it easy for us to disconnect and thus downplay what they're expressing and how they're feeling. So we have to ask, who are we including in our definition of a survivor, and how is that reflected in our practice? So when we cast judgment and change our body language towards someone who doesn't fit into the picture of what we think when we think or when we hear survivor, it excludes so many people that deserve our respect and deserve access in the same ways that someone who fits into the box of how we picture a survivor does have. And this relates to how we see ourselves as Black people and the community that's felt. Whenever there is a Black person in the news, no matter what the reason, there is kind of this ripple effect, or there is this thing that ties us all together just by virtue of our Blackness. So when I see a Black woman can be vice president-elect of the United States, it means that a Black person can lead a meeting and can lead a webinar and can be in a position of power. In the same way, though, and neither of them should necessarily speak for the entire community, but in the same way, when we hear about Black people suffering and being put in positions that make them do things they wouldn't necessarily normally do, or anything like that, it also casts a different light on the community, and all of these kind of ups and downs even us out in a sense. But none of these are warranted in any way. They shouldn't mean anything about the community as a whole. Sorry, go ahead.
As Vatineh said, like one Black person or one Black person from the Black community doesn't speak for our whole community. But I think you also mentioned something that I like to call collective Black grief. And that's something that is real to Black survivor spaces and just Black spaces in general. Like when we think about what does it look like to be a survivor, lack of bodily autonomy is a problem within consent culture. It is a problem within sexual violence to see that Black people aren't given bodily autonomy. It is a survivor issue. So I consider that a part of survivor work, the issue of Black people not being able to move freely in the world.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And it also plays into what we'll touch on in a little bit as like Black people as a monolith. And understanding one Black person's experience is not representative of the whole Black experience. So in kind of shedding this responsibility to serve or represent the Black community well, we need to instead focus on that community healing and using the grief that Black grief that is felt, and being able to also help it fuel our community healing. So we need to make a very conscious effort to, as a community, include survivors that may not fit the mold, and that includes Black men, Black trans folk, and non-binary folk in this same work. So as we have kind of been alluding to, we can't kid ourselves into thinking that what we described prior to this is representative of the whole Black experience. We have to be very clear that Blackness is not universal. It's not one size fits all. And like in any group, we can't fit all Black survivors into one box and apply an empiric solution to their problems. There might be superficial similarities that unify us, and specifically how Black people are perceived and how they can move through the world. But a lot of life experiences, and just by virtue of where you were born, changes your Black experience as well. So like Anuth mentioned, I was born in Thompson, Manitoba, which is rural northern Manitoba, a mining community. And my Blackness and the way that I relate to Black people is heavily influenced by that fact. The fact that there were not very many Black families in Thompson, especially when I was growing up, and even fewer Nigerian families. So me relating to the people I was raised with, which was primarily white people, has influenced how I interact with Black people as well. And that fact has changed the way that I guess, feel about my Blackness as well. And that's something that is kind of an ongoing thing as I continue to move through the world. So like you see in these different examples, or these different ways that are listed on the screen, even that is clear to us, or should make it clear to us, that we cannot assume that all Black people have had these same life experiences and have similar negative experience with police, or only want to seek out alternative methods. Again, we can't just make any assumptions about Blackness. There's a podcast called Dating White. It's hosted by Maisha Battle and Nkechi Njaka. They're two Black mixed race women, and they talk about their experience in being raised in similarly white cultures in like Minnesota, and the way that relates to their dating history and their dating lives now, especially in dating white men. So in one episode, one of the hosts was describing a time where she was on a date with this guy, and he was white, and he was feeling very self-righteous in the fact that he knew about the statistics and he understood the Black experience in sexual violence. But when she said that she had actually never experienced any type of violence in her life, he questioned that, and he actually didn't believe it because he was so familiar with the stats. And this is something that's pretty easy to kind of guffaw at. It's a pretty blatant example of exactly what we're talking about, but it also kind of makes us think about our own practice, makes us wonder, am I making an assumption about this person based on the color of their skin? Essentially, that's what it boils down to. So we want to make sure that in this next section, when we're introducing different ways where we can introduce community healing and alternative or non-traditional methods of attaining justice, we are not assuming that any Black person that walks through our doors is looking for this. Instead, we want to use it as a way to fortify our current practices and to create these spaces, or uplift these spaces that are already existing.
So in terms of focusing on what we have instead of what is missing, I want to add that like there are Black community members and there are Black survivors on campus who are doing the work at a grassroots level, and you need to find them, seek them out, and support them throughout their process. So I think, as Vatineh said earlier, moving away from the white savior complex and understanding that Blackness is not monolith, and Black people are able to provide supports amongst themselves, practice community collective care, and provide different outlooks to survivorship and healing. I also think that there is something to say about like how our community practices like self growth and reliance. Like Vatineh put this picture of the braiding hair. Like these are ways in which we take care of each other and heal with each other. So like it might look different for folks outside of community, but these are valid ways of practicing healing. I also run a survivor support group for Black folks, and we practice survivor-based Reiki healing. And a lot of people might not find it traditional as to how we're going to cope with sexual violence, but a lot of Black survivors who want this type of service, they come to do that because it's familiar to them culturally.
So in our next slide, we'll talk about some examples or some kind of jumping off points of what a Black-centered space actually looks like. And Casandra will expand on this more and has touched a little bit about her group, but I'm excited to hear more about that as we continue along. The first example is engaging in pleasure activism. So Casandra touched on earlier this notion of reclaiming sexuality and reinfusing pleasure into the sexual experience as opposed to soul associations with trauma, with removal, with lack of autonomy. So reinvigorating the pleasure aspect of sex in after experienced sexual or gender-based violence is an important part of the work that Casandra does and the work that we'd like to see people continue to do and implement in their own PSIs after this presentation. Additionally, we're talking about context of where this healing takes place. So it doesn't have to be in a clinic setting or in a counselor's office. Similar to the previous picture we saw, someone braiding hair in their living room, cooking in the kitchen, enjoying people's or your relatives' company. These are all locations and these are all situations in which healing can take place and should take place, even if it doesn't look conventional to us from the outside looking in. We're talking about closed spaces for collective community healing. So we're mentioning this term community, and though we understand that not every Black person even wants to be a part of this community necessarily. Their Blackness is in part imposed just by virtue of how they look. We want to give people the opportunity to center their healing in the community in which they might feel comfortable, in which they were raised, and again, surrounded by people that look like them. And then we talk about access to transformative justice, and Casandra can speak more on what that means. But when we're talking about a system that exists as our general justice system, as basically all the systems that are at play in Canada, in North America, in our Western culture currently, a lot of those systems contribute or were founded solely to oppress Blackness, essentially. So when we're talking about healing, and talking about healing within that system that has existed to keep us down for so long, we want to give alternatives to seeking justice that don't necessarily look typical or what we're used to necessarily, but are sometimes even better serving of the community itself.
So I want to touch on my Black survivor support group. It's something that I started out of the necessity to have my experience centered and also to have collective community care around me as a Black survivor myself. And I was working in other survivor spaces, and I realized every Black survivor was coming to me, talking to me because they were comfortable in like disclosing something that might have happened in the community, or even talking about how they feel hypersexualized through dating apps, or comments about not feeling comfortable moving in their body. And these are unique comments and experiences that I also experienced myself, right? So through this, my school, we have a sexual violence office called Consent Comes First. They supported and funded this group. And I was, yeah, they supported and funded this group. They allowed me to lead the process, and they provided their like allyship support. And that's really important to me because it's not like they asked me to do a workshop, one-time workshop or one-time panel on what it means to be a Black survivor. They understood that Black survivors needed a specific group to be affirmed and to experience alternative healing methods. And they were like, okay, we're gonna support you in doing this. So my group meets every month, and every month we have a different workshop with a co-facilitator, and we explore alternative healing methods. This upcoming month, we're going to have a workshop on reclaiming pleasure and bodily autonomy, which I talked about earlier, through the lens of like Black survivor, through people who have experienced hypersexualization moving throughout white society. So how can we reclaim pleasure within that? We Heal Together is also like survivor ran, like I said, ran by me, and it's student led. We're not providing therapy. That's not what we do there. But again, it's like collective community healing, and we're supporting each other through this process. It is like focused, it is like it acknowledges gender-based violence, of course. But we do have men who attend the group because we understand that colonialism has affected the way that Black men move throughout society too within a sexual gaze. So they attend the group. We like to also acknowledge queer Black bodies and relation and like look at how in queer spaces we practice consent because it's not Black and white. There's a lack of acknowledgement of gender, like same gender based violence and things like that. We also try to talk about accountability and what can transformative justice look like, which is on the next slide. So we talk about non-colonial forms of justice, like how do people practice justice and accountability apart from the colonial aspect of things, which is like police, the court justice system. And we don't want people to feel like they can't do that. Like this is something that I will never push onto someone. It's more so if someone questions, how can I hold a community member accountable in a certain type of way, we could explore transformative justice models. Transformative justice is survivor-centric and the survivor's choice, and it's survivor-led. Like it's all from the perspective of the survivor, and the survivor gets to say in what happens, and it's community care and involvement. So if a survivor is like, I want this elder there to help facilitate a conversation between me and an assailant, between me and someone that has made me uncomfortable, things like that would be how we practice transformative justice. It's also not, it could also be holding your community accountable for things that we perpetuate. So like, how do we perpetuate gender-based violence as a community? Like how are Black men perpetuating sexual violence towards Black women through like catcalling, things like that. Like these are community accountable conversations we can have and acknowledge the different oppressive systems put in place that have like enforced how we see each other sexually. So transformative justice is like, I'm not going to say I'm an expert on it, but it's something that I've been learning to do. Actually, Ryerson held a conference on this about 2 years ago, I believe. And I sat on a panel. It was called Can Justice Heal? And we just explored different ways in which folks acquire justice and accountability from community members who perpetuate sexual violence from any sort of level.
So as we have been touching on, and Cassandra was able to expand upon beautifully, we want to, I guess the undercurrent for this presentation is rejecting what a traditional idea of healing looks like, and instead uplifting and providing legitimacy to these alternative routes of healing, of justice, of coming to peace in whatever is occurring. So we have been kind of peppering this throughout our talk here, but colonialism really is acting as an infection to our dominant Western culture or society. And it has created this superiority complex where pain is seen as an opportunity to homogenize, to invade tradition, to make everything one. And these ideas are part of what made early feminism exclusionary. Women need a seat at the table, but only some women. Voting rights are so important, but not for everyone. So this imposition of the dominant way as the right way has created an environment where survivors feel discouraged from seeking these alternative routes, or they're stopped altogether, even though those alternatives might be better suited to what they need, what their healing looks like. So when we're talking about intersectionality, an intersectional approach should be survivor-centric in that we're making space for this work to continue as it has been continuing for as long as we can remember. And again, moving away from this white savior complex that my way is the right way and you're in pain, so let me heal you. Instead, lifting up these methods that have been existing and we can encourage to continue and to exist in even greater capacity than they already do is what our work should stem from. And in this idea of stemming from, we need to return to our why in what makes us do this work. So giving legitimacy to these methods that we've talked about so far should contribute to furthering our collective goal of supporting survivors, that being our underlying motivation. So we have to recognize that the default does not equal better. It doesn't make it, just because it's more comfortable doesn't make it correct. And sometimes people are even better served by deviating from the systems that have created so much harm in the past. So in the next slide, the way that I kind of visualizing it and understanding it is thinking about the ecosystem of our post-secondary institution. And this, again, brings us back to our why. So the figure or the picture that I've included here is of a community garden. So in a community garden, everyone has their own individual crops and they take care of their own plot, but it's not a solo activity. It's not an individual activity. There can be a deliberate exchange of knowledge, just taking care of your neighbor and making sure that their growing season is great. And but there's also an involuntary or an accidental exchange. Just by virtue of sharing soil and being in close proximity, we are increasing the biodiversity that exists in these spaces. We're increasing access to different insects and cross-pollination and all of this like involuntary exchange is happening. And this leads to positive changes in both what you're taking away, what you're bringing back, but also in the land itself. And that is a positive change that exists for better growing seasons in the future as well. So this idea of the symbiosis and this exchange also exists at our post-secondary institutions because of our mutual goal. So Black folk are hurting and we are needing to fight for this ability to defend ourselves and to protect ourselves and to raise ourselves up. But we also need the action of sexual violence frontline workers and administrators at these PSIs, because they are the people ultimately that hold the power to make these changes and to support these existing efforts and make them long-term and make them bigger than they would be otherwise. So you need Black people's voices and their opinions to be able to better serve your Black student body. So we can share deliberately this space and knowledge to create this noticeable and long-lasting change. And hopefully we can also change the environment to make it better for many, many more seasons to come.
I wanted to also add before we go that as survivors in general, we should think of like, what does it look like to have solidarity? Because a lot of the people who are doing the frontline work are also survivors. A lot of people experience gender-based violence. So I think of like solidarity other than allyship when it comes to our community. So how are we going to practice solidarity with each other and within survivor communities? What does that look like? I just want people to think about that more. When we think of survivor spaces, it's like literally about solidarity. Oh, thank you everyone for coming to our webinar.
Yeah, well,
Yes,
thank you
that's
so
all
much,
from us.
Vatineh.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Vatineh, and thank you, Casandra. That was really powerful and very helpful. And now I'd like to invite our attendees to share any questions and comments. And you can do so by typing these into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Okay, lovely. I can see that we have a couple already. So our first question, Vatineh and Casandra, are how should I begin to create trust with Black groups on campus in order to start doing this work?
Yeah, so I think that creating trust, I think, starts with the like really internalizing the idea that there is a reason for distrust and for not fully giving yourself up to this process, because like we outlined before, there is harm associated with it. And in kind of keeping that in mind, my hope is that we're able to I guess recognize and not necessarily put a lot of personal feelings into not being fully drawn in initially. But I think as far as how to actually progress in doing this work, it comes from putting yourself at the same level as your community, and not coming in as, you know, you're the hero that's saving it, like Casandra has touched on. And I think that's a good undercurrent to leave us off, is thinking about working together and putting yourself on an even playing field, that you recognize that mistakes are very probable and possible, and making yourself open to understanding when a mistake has happened, and to hearing and not becoming defensive when you know that a mistake has happened, or when someone tells you that a mistake has happened. And then from there, just walking together, being very intentional about the application of the ideas that are brought forward, as opposed to, oh yes, I'll think about that, you know, making these tangible changes, and expediting these changes so that your Black community knows that they're being prioritized or put into importance here.
And also understanding like sometimes these Black communities might need spaces where you're not able to join into. There might be closed spaces, like my group, for example, is a closed space for Black community, and it's not to be exclusionary or like segregate, it's to provide comfortability. So understand that as well. And just try, one thing I noticed is like, there's like an ownership of survivor spaces sometimes. And it shouldn't be that way, like where you feel like you have to have an ownership of a space. It can become very exclusionary for people who might not understand all the lingo when it comes to survivor work, and might not have done the work that a lot of people have done. So like, just try not to have an ownership of the space, and understand a space for healing and support. Yeah.
Absolutely, thank you. So the next question then is, what are some steps that we can take to create a survivor-led support group on our campus?
I think just to touch briefly on this point. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Okay. So some steps that you can take, I don't know if your school has a student union, but you could bring forth write up to them with your demands, with the needs for the space, if you want a survivor-led space. Also grassroots work as well, reaching out to faculty and staff. A lot of people care about creating a space for survivors. It's just that it's hard to connect the dots at times with who to reach out to. But I also think starting off with just your collective group at first works. and then reaching out to external resources, whether it's your student union or any admin staff who you feel like have politics that align with your space. I know not every university has an office for sexual violence support. I'm thankful for Ryerson for that, but if they do, reaching out to them works as well.
Yeah, I think the only other thing I have to touch on that point is just this idea that it doesn't have to be a lot. It can be you and one other person who have this idea, and that alone, just creating that space is part of the work, is leading you closer to your goal. So just making that known and making that available to people is a fantastic first step.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both. And Casandra, I have a follow-up question for you on that. So for the Black Survivor Support Group, folks are curious about how that space has been going, within an online environment. Have you noticed any changes or any additional barriers since the shift to an online space?
Yes, definitely, because people are like experiencing Zoom fatigue right now. I am also like thinking we're also creating like documents for people, not just like having meetings. We have Zoom meetings, but we're also creating like documents. We have a Black collective grief document that was created from our first workshop of the year, and a lot of people have found it really helpful. We have like a Facebook forum group. So there's like alternatives to how we could support each other. It's not the same as it was before, but we're trying our best to provide support for students. We also created some really great graphics with Black Power Barbie. She's a artist, and she created those beautiful graphics that I shared earlier, and they're very affirmative and they're very representative of Black community care, Black survivor-led spaces. So just trying to provide alternatives is what we're doing, but yeah, it has been hard. Oh, what is bringing you joy in this moment? Just being in this space. I think that it's good to have met Vatineh because it's nice to meet another Black person doing this type of work and who cares about community in this type of way. So it was really nice to meet you and talk to you about these things. So that's bringing me joy. Yeah.
Same to you. I think it's strange, especially because I'm in Winnipeg, so like I can see outside we just got like many inches of snow. So I'm thinking about like how to stay happy indoors. And maybe contrary to my resistance to winter, I'm enjoying a lot of like winter themed movies and just like being very comfortable in that and staying home and washing my hands and wearing my mask and being safe. But yeah, I'm finding a lot of joy in delving into this topic. And it's something that is kind of an undercurrent to my life, but I had never really taken the time to sit down and think about synthesizing all of my resources and all of the things that I've learned into something that is like presentable and understanding it in that way. So that has also brought me a lot of joy, just recognizing the power in all the work that's been done and thinking about all the work that is coming as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Casandra. Thank you, Vat. So our next question from an attendee is, I have a small population of Black students at my school. How might I cater to them when there are not any additional resources yet?
I think my first thought is regarding about, what are the practical things that you can do? Because Sandra raised a great point about seeking advice from your student union and support through them. In my experience, like talking with the student union and people that are more in tune with what's going on the ground, so to say, is easier in general. So I would say that is a really great starting off point. I would also say that making use of what you already have and just kind of fortifying it with what we've discussed is also a great first step. So if you don't necessarily have the means to hire on different people, making sure that the people you do have are very well versed in this topic and coming at this topic with that level playing field, with that understanding that there is room for error, with seeking out peer supports that are Black, that is another great step that doesn't necessarily increase your cost as much, but still is contributing to this like peer-to-peer support or like Black person to Black person support. I think that is another great avenue to take to be able to increase the support that you're able to give your maybe smaller Black population on campus.
Thank you. So I know we have a lot of questions that folks want to ask, but I think we have time for maybe 2 more. So Vatineh and Casandra, folks are asking, how might I create solidarity with Black survivors whose lived experiences differ from my own as a non-Black survivor?
So like I said earlier, that's like creating survivor solidarity, which is what I like to call it. So that's listening to people's experiences. That's the first one. Doing external resources. I know someone in the comments, Farah, hi Farah, asked about 3 books you would recommend for people to reach and better support Black survivors. So I mentioned Black Sexual Politics. Hunger by Roxane Gay is one of my favorite books to read for representation on what it means, like what sexual violence could do to Black women. It's also a good read if you want to learn about fat phobia and how that intersects. Another book, you throw one in there today. You go.
Sure.
I already said.
No, yeah, you're doing the legwork on this one. My contribution is Policing Lives. Policing Black Lives by Robin Maynard. I'm just looking it up here. That I think will give you the perspective, and I think there was a comment specifically about like Black men and understanding their survivorship. I don't know if I have a resource for that necessarily. There are some articles that I've seen floating around, but not like a fully fledged book necessarily. But I think Policing Black Lives will give you an understanding specifically to a Canadian context and understanding that, and when it comes to the relationship between Black folk and the police.
In terms of like Black men survivors, I think Black Sexual Politics touches a lot on how the Black masculine body has been hypersexualized, which I don't really see often. So if you would like to read that, it could give you more insight. And also Bell Hooks is a good person to read if you want to deconstruct how sexuality affects Black men and masculinity. So yeah.
Great, thank you, Casandra. Thank you, Vatineh. I'm excited to explore some of those titles a bit more as well. And, maybe in the last 2 minutes of our webinar, I can also chime in with a resource offering, because Card Show Act has built a list of resources for gender justice advocates to challenge anti-Black racism. And so this is available on the blog section of our website. So any gender justice advocates at Canadian PSIs who are on this call, on this webinar, we invite you to read, engage, and implement some action plans with the help of those resources and the resources that Casandra and Vatineh shared today. So Casandra and Vatineh, thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. We've had a really good discussion. We've learned a ton, and the recording will be available on our website in a few days, along with a transcript. And so thank you, everyone. Thank you to our participants for joining us and for sharing with us today. We take inspiration and appreciate your commitment to addressing and preventing gender-based violence on your campus. We feel very lucky to be able to work alongside each and every one of you. So thank you for joining us, and a kind reminder as well to complete the evaluation forms at the end. And another gentle reminder as well, because our registration is actually open now for our National Skillshare Series beginning in January 2021. And the Skillshare series will highlight the really groundbreaking work happening across Canada to address gender-based violence on campus. And it'll showcase the 15 tools and the toolkits that are being developed by 150 plus project partners, including our communities of practice. So you can sign up for that on our website. Yeah, that's all for me for now. Thank you so much, Casandra. Thank you, Vatineh, as well. And we'll see you at the next webinar series.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Take care.